Okay, and finally, we will hear from Wayne. Wayne Hsiung is a lawyer, a writer, and the founding organizer of Direct Action Everywhere. Wayne is a behavioral science grad of the University of Chicago and MIT, and is a social justice campaign organizer. Just last week, Wayne was arrested while leading a group of activists into a San Francisco slaughterhouse and rescuing hens awaiting slaughter in broad daylight. Please join me in welcoming Wayne.
Thank you. So I'm the last speaker on a long day, so I'm going to try and keep things interesting with some stories, anecdotes. But I'd really encourage any of you, if you want some more conceptual insight, to come and chat with me afterwards, because I have a lot of thoughts about strategy as well. But as Caitlin said, I was in jail last week. I was actually a little worried I wouldn't make it here in time, but they let me out without bond, because I was planning to not pay the bond if they did issue a bond, but they didn't ask for a bond, so I got out. And I've made this into a little bit of an annual tradition at the Asheville VeganFest, because last year I was also in jail right before Asheville VeganFest, but I didn't actually even tell anyone because it was still confidential. I was in a Chinese jail. And I'll say a little bit more about the slaughterhouse action tomorrow. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences in China, because they've really shaken me to the core, and they've taught me some really important lessons that I want to share with all of you. But really the story of me and China and animals goes back much farther than just last year when we went to Yiling, China and rescued some dogs. I have been embedded in the Chinese and Buddhist community my entire life. My family has, I think, an over 1,000-year history of Buddhism and compassion for animals. We lost our way in the 1950s as a result of a civil war that split my family apart. So in 1949, my family was on the wrong side of a civil war. Half of us got evicted, the other half got sent to camps. And in 1989, 40 years after we were kicked out of the country, we went back for the first time. I went back with my grandfather, who's a hard, angry man. He was a general in the Taiwanese army. I never even saw him smile. He never expressed any affection to me or any of the other family members in my life. And for the first time, I saw him cry, because he saw his little brother, who he had been separated from for 40 years for the first time. But what should have been a really triumphant and amazing, powerful, hopeful experience for all of us, going back to our home country after 40 years of being ostracized and removed, was a traumatic one. And the reason was I saw what was happening to animals up close for the first time in my life. So in China, unlike in the United States, we do not hide the slaughter of animals behind closed doors. We don't have big industrial slaughterhouses, although that's changing because of companies like Smithfield. We don't have big CAFOs where animals are raised by the thousands. Up until the 1980s and 1990s, 95% of the pigs in China were raised in farms where there are 5 or fewer pigs. And these pigs are slaughtered not in big camps and factories thousands of miles or hundreds of miles from urban centers. They're slaughtered right in the market for you to see. And as a 9-year-old kid who had faced a lot of racism and isolation in central Indiana growing up after we emigrated to the United States, my dog was my best friend in the world. When I got to China in 1989, I walked to a restaurant that's called a Wild Earth restaurant. They have these restaurants in China where the idea behind them is you want to sample from all the flora and fauna of the universe. They have snakes and raccoons and even monkeys. And I still remember, and I'll remember this until the day that I died, the first thing I saw as we were approaching this restaurant was a cage on top of a number of other cages with a little hand coming out of the cage. I could just see her fingers. And a little baby primate, before they have all the fur on their hands look a lot like a human child's hands. And I looked up and I saw a hand stretch out of this cage, and I said to my parents, why is there a little kid in the cage? But it wasn't a little kid. It was a primate. This primate had a collar around her neck, and if a customer came by, pointed at her, she would be killed, cut up for food on the spot for that restaurateur's plate. There are other animals in this restaurant. There are raccoons. And raccoons, many of us have probably had experience with raccoons. They're really fierce animals, right? They're tough and vibrant and energetic. But these raccoons were very different. And I don't know if it was because of rain or because they tortured these animals, but all these raccoons were drenched and covered with water. So the fur was pressed up against their face. And, I mean, a lot like waterboarding, they were completely defeated. They were cowering in the bottom of their cages. They were barely even moving. They were alive, we knew, because we could hear their breathing. We could see their eyes flicker. But they had no energy or life left in their bodies. The death that was coming from them, in many ways, was a kindness, given the torture they endured for weeks or months in a cage. But the thing that really blew my mind and shook me, and still shakes me to this day, was I heard barking in the back of the restaurant. And these weren't companion animals. They weren't pets. They weren't service animals. They were dogs held in cages that were going to be killed and eaten. you have to understand, as a little kid, a 9-year-old kid, whose only friend in the world was a dog, this was a traumatic experience. I broke down on the ground. I was crying, weeping uncontrollably. I begged my parents to do something about it, and what they said to me at the time was, there's nothing for us to do. This is just what people here are taught. This is what they're taught. And it was the first time in my life that I realized that many of the things that we are taught are not actually right. So there have been 30 years since that first experience of animal abuse up close and personal, and over the past 30 years, I've basically spent my entire life thinking about how we can change things. How we can get to the point where a little kid who's crying outside of a slaughterhouse in China no longer has to cry, where a little primate baby who's trapped in a cage with a collar around his neck no longer has to cower in fear, and where those dogs who were slaughtered on that day in 1989 in southern China are free, happy, and safe. And I think I've learned 3 lessons, and a lot of them I've learned from my people in China, and I'm going to share a few of them. So fast forward about 25, 30 years from that experience in China, I went back to China. I've gone back to China many times to learn from the animal advocates in China, and there is an incredible movement in China. I'm going to give a shout out to Eugene for acknowledging that people of color are fighting for animal rights and veganism just as much as folks in America or in European countries. But there's a growing movement in China, and I've been trying to learn from them, and I've learned 3 things from them. The first is, if we want to understand how to change the world, we have to understand at the root of this problem is not individual choices. It's not that people individually have all decided one by one, I hate animals, I want to torture them and kill them and eat them. It's that there are systems of oppression that are indoctrinating all of us. That's the first lesson I've learned from them. The second lesson is that the way we change these systems of oppression is by using a tool that has been used for the past 200 years to change the world. And that's nonviolent direct action. The third lesson I learned from the Chinese activists is that to mobilize and inspire people to direct action, you need 2 ingredients. You need a bold vision and a strong community. So I'll go through each of these point by point. So the first, systems rather than individuals. So I've gone back to China many times over the past couple of years to try and understand why people are killing and eating dogs and other animals. And one of the most surprising things about going to a place like Yulin, China, or frankly, most of southern China, where I'd say about 20 to 30% of people still eat dogs, is when you ask them why they eat dogs, they don't have an answer. In fact, they don't even have a concept of why you would be asking that question in the first place. Last year when we went back to China, our goal was to identify a dog meat farm and a dog meat slaughterhouse, place undercover cameras inside the slaughterhouse, and rescue as many of the dogs as we could. To do that, we needed to find out where the restaurants were getting their dog meat. So I went restaurant by restaurant throughout Yulin, China, and asked these people, where do you get your dogs, and where can I find a similar dog? And over again, these restaurateurs gave me the same response. Our dogs are right here. And they point on the plate where a cut-up dog was sitting as a corpse on someone's dinner plate. And I'd say again, I want a live dog. I want to know where the live dogs are. This is dog meat. I want to know where the live dogs are. And they'd say, no, you don't understand. This meat is very fresh. The dogs were alive very recently. So the point of this story is that within these people's experience and their background and their history, they didn't understand why you would be interested in a live dog because their entire indoctrination, their culture, their way of thinking was organized around thinking of dogs and other animals as just things. Right? It might not be a just way of thinking. In fact, most of us in this room probably think it's a profoundly unjust way of thinking. But every single moment of their lives, every conversation they've had, every educational experience they've had has been motivating them to conceive of that dog as just a thing. And when someone tries to disrupt that mentality and comes with a different story, different way of thinking, it's outside of their universe. So it took me 6 or 7 restaurants before I got to the point where one of these restaurateurs actually understood my question, because none of them could get a grip on why we want to know where live dogs are. So this is an example of systemic oppression. The violence against these dogs wasn't something that these Chinese people, they're born into the world and they get a choice at the age of 3. Do you want to torture and kill dogs, or do you not want to torture and kill dogs? They're born into this system and culture that tells them that it is appropriate and normal to torture and kill dogs, and no one ever asks a different sort of question. In the United States, we have similar systems of oppression that indoctrinate us to think that people of color and other marginalized categories are beneath us, that they deserve whatever violence they face, and that the other life on this planet is lesser and inferior to us and deserves the fate they receive in slaughterhouses and factory farms. I'll give you some trivial examples. You look at the food pyramid. The food pyramid doesn't talk about the animals that are killed for food. It talks about the animals as meat. And the food pyramid is part of a massive infrastructure that the American government has organized for the past 200 years to exploit and dominate the other life on this planet. So the USDA, every 5 years, passes the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill devotes $120 billion, it's a B, not M, but a B, $120 billion to animal agriculture, investing in violence against animals. So this is a systemic institutional decision that's made by powerful decision makers that's beyond the control of any one of us. But it actually ends up subjecting billions of individual animals to unspeakable torment. So that is a decision that none of us get to choose for ourselves. Frankly, even the people who are running the USDA don't really choose it. It's something that's a tradition, an indoctrination, an institution that's existed for hundreds of years in that country that is outside the realm of any individual's choice. But it is a choice, because we could spend that $120 billion investing in veganic farming, educational initiatives to teach people about health and animal rights and social justice, or investing in researchers and campaigners like Ashley Capps. But instead, that $120 billion is going to animal agriculture. So what we need to change is not just individual choices, although individual choices play a very important role in this movement. We need to change the systems of oppression that affect all of us and that right now are outside of our control. So that brings me to the second point. How do we change these systems of oppression? So in China, it's not just cultural norms, but also the law conceives of dogs and other animals as just things, objects, no different than this bottle of water, this cup of water. And it would be no different for me to crumple this bottle of water or this cup of water or smash it under my foot into the ground as if I took an animal, living, breathing, sensitive creature, and smashed her under my heel. The law treats both of these things as the same, when we know they're very different. This cup is not the same as a dog, a pig, a cat, or myself, right? This cup is inanimate. It doesn't have feelings. So the question is, when you have these big institutions, subsidies, government, laws, even culture, shaping the way each of us as individuals make our choices, how do we change those systems? Well, Bill McKibben, the famous environmental activist, wrote a piece of incredible insight in The Nation recently, and the headline of this paper was this: the nonviolent direct action, nonviolent disruption, is the greatest innovation of the 20th century, and it's key to saving the 21st. And what I want to suggest, and what I learned in China, is that if we want to change the system, not just individual decisions, but the system as a whole, we need to learn the power of nonviolent direct action, of disruption, confrontation, and civil disobedience against a system that has gone completely mad. When you read about what's happening in China, Chinese activists are not going one by one to individual dog meat vendors or dog meat consumers to try and convince them to stop eating dog meat. There is some of that. But the big, powerful initiatives are directed at the government and other powerful decision makers who are controlling not just one dog here or two dogs here, but 20 million dogs being tortured and killed across the entire country. And the way they've done this is with powerful marches, disruptions, civil disobedience, dramatic media campaigns where activists have rushed out to the streets, blocked slaughterhouse trucks on the way to the slaughterhouse, grabbed all the dogs and run off and taken them to sanctuary. These powerful actions have created dramatic stories, and this is the first and most important attribute of nonviolent direct action, that it inspires people to action through powerful storytelling. Think about the great social justice movements of the past 200 years. The independence movement in India, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement. When we think back to these stories of social change, of these effective movements from history, we don't think about just changing individuals one by one. We think about confrontations between brave activists against a powerful institution or system that's trying to subject victims to violence. That is the story we need to start telling in the animal rights movement. It is a story that Chinese activists have started to tell, and it led to a successful end to dog meat being served at the Yiling Dog Meat Festival this year for the first time. So before you cheer too much, dog meat is still being served in Yiling. It's still being sold in China. But we are on a path to changing the entire government, the political structure, the political DNA of the entire nation, because these activists have been powerful and dramatic in confronting a system of oppression. But it takes more and more activists engage in training, community building, education, legal support, to get to the point where we have hundreds or thousands of activists bravely willing to stand up to that system of oppression and asking ordinary people, not attacking them and saying they're bad people for making a choice they never really made, but standing up against a system, an institution that frankly victimizes them as much as it victimizes the animals. So that brings me to the third point. How do we get to that point? How do we get to the point where we have a mass movement like in China, where we have hundreds or thousands of people confronting systems of oppression, running right into slaughterhouses, running into government institutions, and nonviolently saying, enough is enough. We just have to stop this violence now. And again, we can look through history and social science to get the answer to this question. And the answer is two things. One is we have to have a bold vision, right? And this is very much in line with what Casey and Ashley have been saying. We have to have a clear, bold vision. And the reason for this is if you're going to inspire people to risk their lives, their freedom, their families, their careers for a cause, you better have something great to offer, right? You have to have a bold vision of the world that is dramatic enough and beautiful enough that people are willing to fight for it. So dog meat campaigners didn't go to the government and say, well, do you think you could electrocute them instead of beating them to death? Or, those transport trucks, they're really confined. Can you put 3 dogs in a cage instead of 4? They said, we need to end dog meat now. This is an atrocity. This is humankind's best friend that we are brutalizing, and we are going to stop it. And when they made that demand of the government, when they made that demand to the world, they rallied thousands of activists all over the country. And the biggest marches against dog meat in Beijing, China, they had over 100,000 people. How many times have we had 100,000 people marching for veganism and animal rights? And the reason we haven't is we've been afraid of our own vision. We think it's scary, it's too radical, it's too dramatic to imagine a world where every single slaughterhouse in this country is shut down or replaced by a sanctuary, where every single farm in this country isn't operating with violence and corporate greed and profit, but operating the way Eugene's farms operate, veganic, social justice farming that's controlled by the people for the people. We need to have that vision of the world if we're going to mobilize 100,000 people for animal rights. But the second thing we need, and it's just as important as the bold vision, is we need to understand the importance of community support, of seeing friendships, of potlucks, of all the things that we do together as vegans day to day in our personal lives to make ourselves happier and safer people is instrumental to the growth of that movement, right? Instead of making a clean distinction between frontline activism and support work, we understand that the frontline activism is only possible with the support work behind the scenes. I'll give you a trivial example of this. When we went to China, we rescued 3 dogs. We put cameras inside of slaughterhouses. It was on national television last year. But I got thrown in jail. I was interrogated for almost 20 hours nonstop. And frankly, I had no idea when I was going to get out or whether anyone even knew I was out. But I'm here today because DXC had an incredible support network of lawyers, of press operatives, of just good people willing to tweet on Facebook and write on Facebook and tweet on Twitter about what was happening to us in China. If we didn't have that support from thousands of people around the country and around the world, I might very well still be in jail in China today. Right? So movements grow, they flourish, they strengthen, and they change the world when they have a fertile ground of community support to allow that plant to grow. So the community building we're doing today, the conversations we're having today, the things we're learning from each other today, are things that are the vital lifeblood of this movement. This movement will only grow when we understand the importance of personal connection, community support. So many times as vegans, we feel very lonely and isolated from each other, right? We feel like even in our own communities, we're being marginalized. We need to see the power of connection, the power of conferences and events like this, where we're working in the same physical space, where we're crying together, we're fighting together, we're strategizing together, we're dreaming and imagining a better world together. And if we do that, we can create the fertile ground for a movement to grow for animals. So here's the last thing I want to say. So we need 3 ingredients for effective activism, as seen by the Chinese campaign against dog meat. We need to understand that our target should be systems. We shouldn't be attacking individuals. We should be attacking systems and understanding the intersectional commonality of oppression, that the fact that most people in this country are not actually being benefited by animal agriculture. They're victimized. They're indoctrinated into the system in the same way that we once were, right? So seeing that it's systemic oppression, instead of attacking individuals, allows us to diagnose the root of the problem and mobilize more people in support. The second thing we need to do is understand the power of nonviolent direct action. Understand that the way we stop the system is by putting something in its gears to slow it down and eventually wrench it to a halt. And third, the way we inspire people to take direct action is with 1, a bold vision, and 2, community support. The last thing I want to say that ties all this together is the important role that each and every one of you have in this movement. So there's a really cool paper. I used to be an economist, believe it or not, and one of my former teachers wrote a paper recently about the Arab Spring, this incredibly revolutionary movement that brought down dictatorships. I think it's something like 7 different countries. Dictatorships that most political scientists thought, these dictatorships have ruled for 100 years. They're never going to go down. And it's impossible for it to happen in the next 5 years. Maybe in the next 500, maybe in the next 5,000. But some of these dictatorships have lasted for a few hundred years. It's not going to change anytime soon. But it changed, and it changed incredibly dramatically. And what ignited it all was one man in Tunisia by the name of Mohamed Bouazizi lighting himself on fire, engaging in an act of nonviolent direct action outside of a government office, and he's saying to the world, enough is enough. I'm tired of being bullied. I'm tired of being beaten up by the police. I'm tired of having my fruit stolen from me. I can't even feed my family. In an act of defiance, the one last thing I have left, my life, I'm going to take it, literally burn myself alive to show my resistance to this movement. And for a long time, many of us, including me, saw this incident and thought this was an individual act of bravery that would cause this dramatic transformation around the world, was one individual act of bravery that catalyzed a movement of change. But that's actually not true. The conventional story is not actually accurate. And the reason we know this is social scientists have actually looked at this. And 2 independent studies at Oxford and Stanford have found when you actually look at the protest activity that mobilized across the world, not just in Tunisia, but in Egypt and Turkey, even in countries like Saudi Arabia, which still unfortunately have dictatorships but are changing as well, it didn't happen because one person burned themselves alive. What happened was that one person, Mohamed Bouazizi, who burned himself alive, triggered mobilizations independently across the world. And when protests grew and expanded, the person who usually led these protests wasn't a figurehead or a leader or some dramatically experienced organizer who'd been working for 20, 30 years. It was ordinary people who maybe had never been to a protest before, tweeting for the first time and leading to people in their community tweeting about it as well and eventually mobilizing on the streets. So this is the power of what political scientists call the peripheral protester. If you're not a protester, if you're not someone who's worked on the front line, you probably think to yourself, I can never do that. I can never take direct action. I can never run into a slaughterhouse and run out with the chickens. But the key to changing the world is actually seeing the power that you have. The power that you have as an ordinary person to take change into your own hands. And this is what the animal rights movement needs more than anything else. To see the leadership and strength that each of us as individuals has. Because when it comes to your community, your family, your coworkers, your culture, your religion, you are the world's expert. I'm a Chinese kid who grew up in Indiana. I don't know anything about North Carolina. For me to come in here and speak is frankly a little bit of a farce because I don't know the first thing about how to change things in Asheville. But who does know? You. You know. So if there's one take-home I want you to take away from this presentation, it said see the power in yourself. But see the power more than just in yourself, and the power of a community of people coming together, learning from each other, making friendships with each other, building relationships and decision-making mechanisms with each other to change the world when they collectively see the collective power they have when they take change into their own hands. And when we see that power, when you see that power, I'm confident we'll change the entire world for animals. Thank you very much.